Hey, good afternoon, North Harbor. Time for our midweek devotion. We're going to move on into Acts chapter 16 after we dealt with Acts 15 last week. And Acts 15 sits at the heart of the whole book. It is so important that we understand Acts chapter 15. Go on our website and listen to last week's sermon if you haven't done that already. But in brief, in Acts chapter 15, there's a big council in Jerusalem among the church leaders, and they're trying to decide what to do with all these non-Jewish converts to the Christian faith. So Christianity up to this point is a Jewish messianic movement. And most of the people in the church are Jewish people who go about their worship in very Jewish ways, but who also believe that Jesus is the promised king and is raised from the dead. But as this message begins to spread out beyond Jerusalem and Israel, what we're finding is that there's a lot of non-Jewish people coming in, and there's a lot of Jewish Christians who believe that they should keep the law of Moses, the dietary laws, the circumcision, Sabbath, all these things that Jews did for centuries. And there's a big council trying to discuss this because Paul and his associates are seeing lots of non-Jewish people come to faith in Jesus, and his argument is that they should not be forced to keep Jewish cultural and religious practices in order to come to faith. And so there's a big discussion about this, and the group emerges from their discussion, and they basically say, we don't want to make it difficult for those Gentiles who are turning to God. And so they give them just a handful of things that they have to be aware of as they come to faith. And all of those things revolve around pagan worship. Basically what the group says is you can't worship as a pagan and still worship God. You got to forsake your worship of other gods and come to Christ. And so I love that phrase because they come out saying, let's not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God, which means they are not going to require non-Jewish people who become Christians to take on Jewish culture and religious observance. In other words, the gospel goes out and it moves through all cultures, and someone who's Greek does not have to leave their Greek culture in order to become a Christian. Someone who's Roman does not need to forsake their Roman culture, their local culture, to become a Christian outside of worshiping other deities. So you gotta leave that behind and worship the one true God. And so as we get to Acts 16, the very beginning, in light of this big decision in Acts chapter 15, it's kind of a surprising start to the next chapter. It almost seems contradictory. And so as Paul moves on in his work, it says that Paul went first to Derbe and then to Lystra, where there was a young disciple named Timothy. And here we're introduced to Timothy, the same Timothy we see. The books, 1st and 2nd Timothy, are Paul's letters to Timothy. He becomes a church leader, and here we are introduced to him. His mother was a Jewish believer, but his father was Greek. Timothy was well thought of by the believers in Lystra and Iconium. So Paul wanted him to join them on their journey. So Paul wants to recruit him. Here's a young man with promise to be a pastor or be a teacher or a preacher. And, it's sort of like this model of apprenticing. Let's bring him along so he can see what we're doing. And then it goes on to say, in deference to the Jews of the area, he arranged for Timothy to be circumcised before they left. This is a Jewish practice. This is something that in the previous chapter they said, converts don't need to be circumcised. But I love that phrase. In deference to Jews of the area, he arranged for Timothy to be circumcised before they left. For everyone knew that his father was Greek. Then they went from town to town, instructing the believers to follow the decisions made by the apostles and elders in Jerusalem. This is referring back to that chapter 15 decision. So the churches were strengthened in their faith and grew larger every day. Now, this is really interesting because his mother is Jewish, and therefore he's considered Jewish, not Greek, even though his father is Greek. And I'm not sure of all the reasons why it goes through the mother's line, except for maybe the very practical thought that you know exactly who someone's mother is. In that world and in this world, you're not always sure who the father is. So he's definitely Jewish. And because he's Jewish, in Jewish tradition, he should be circumcised. Now, we just saw a debate in the previous chapter where it says, this doesn't really affect his salvation, his standing with God, that he comes in on equal footing. But Paul, even though in that previous chapter he so vehemently argued against the need for people to be circumcised, here he says, in deference to the Jews of the area, he arranged for Timothy to be circumcised. And I love this because Paul goes in not with rules, to check off a list. The goal isn't keeping the rules. The goal is that the message of God, the gospel, goes forward into these other cultures. And as he goes into this area, he sees a very large Jewish community. And in deference, knowing that this is going to be a stumbling block, Timothy not being circumcised, knowing that that's going to be a stumbling block for them hearing the message of the gospel, in deference to that, he has him get circumcised. And so I think if this was a theological debate about the rights and wrongs of circumcision, Paul would argue that no, he doesn't have to, that in the kingdom of God, there is neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, free or slave, that it doesn't matter. Everyone has an equal footing, an equal invitation into the kingdom. But as he's looking at this in terms of the message going forward and not being hindered, he knows that people seeing this, that Timothy his mother's Jewish and he hasn't been circumcised, that's going to stand as a stumbling block to some Jews in the area. And they're not going to be able to see beyond that distraction. They're not going to be able to see the message or hear the message beyond that. And so in deference to them, he has Timothy get circumcised. Now, this is really powerful because I think that in the American culture, our default mode is to fight for our rights. It's individualism. It's the pursuit of happiness. That's the highest goal. And when we see anyone stand that way, we're going to fight for our own rights. But Paul, in this message, in this desire to see the gospel go forward, is willing to put things aside so that God shines all the more. He's looking at what are the hang-ups of those people going to have, and how can I situate myself, not according to my rights, not according to my what I need or what I feel like I need, but what do they need to hear this message? And he goes out of his way, and Timothy goes out of his way to do the things they need to do so that people can hear the message. And so there's an element of taking the high road. And this comes up in, his letters. He writes a letter to the Corinthians and a letter to the Roman church as well, where this issue comes up. Just briefly here in Romans 14, it says, "Don't tear apart the work of God over what you eat." This is dietary laws. "Remember, all foods are acceptable, but it's wrong to eat something if it makes another person stumble." So the issue isn't the food. It's not that it's wrong to eat. The issue and where our ethic and our stance towards the world around us is this going to cause someone to stumble? It is better not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything else if it might cause another believer to stumble. You may believe there's nothing wrong with what you are doing, but keep it between yourself and God. There's no need to show off. There's no need to yell from the rooftop here. Just keep it between you and God. Blessed are those who don't feel guilty for doing something they have decided is right. And so I love this because I think that in our culture, with the conflict we see online on Facebook and other social media, and over racism and over masks and pandemic and what the government's doing and what it's not doing, and schools opening, and there's so many opinions around that we may have strong opinions about, but what the gospel is about is proclaiming the love of God to others. And when we find that something we do may stand in the way, what Paul is saying here is that we can set that aside for the greater message of the gospel and salvation to go out. So that's our midweek message. Think about how that may apply to you in your day-to-day interactions. And this Sunday, we don't have an in-person meeting. We will have a sermon posted online. The place where we normally meet, we will not be able to meet this coming Sunday. So please don't show up at Thomas Point Beach. We won't be there, but there'll be a sermon online in the next section in Acts chapter 16. And so we'll see you back at Thomas Point Beach on September 13th for our baptism celebration. See you then. Bye.